I'm Matt Van Vliet. I'm here with Kimberly Cassidy. Say hi, Kimberly.
Hi.
And today we wanted to talk about the process of getting into managing projections when you haven't done that before. Um, I met Kimberly when she joined a services consulting organization that I was with. And as she joined, she had not worked in the services industry before. Kimberly, maybe give a little bit of your background before joining the organization.
Yeah, so Matt, before I joined the services world, I actually came from more very product-oriented organization. I worked on products, everything from like Madden for EA Sports through to grocery delivery service and some other really interesting and fun things over the years. But I always came from a product base. And so all of the times when I owned a P&L, I owned a P&L where we were selling some actual product. Either we were selling software or we were selling, selling actual concrete goods. And so owning, like looking at a profit and loss statement for those types of things is a very different than what I experienced when I came into the services organization.
Yeah, so I was in a seat where I was responsible for the overall projections for the organization and making sure that as a company we were making good investment decisions and we were rapidly growing and scaling. Kimberly came in, and initially, Kimberly, your responsibilities were for a project, not for an entire organization, correct?
Yeah, correct. So because I'd never been in services before, I did come in, I took a project, and then I took a client, and then multiple clients, and then a region at the company.
So at the project level, when you're looking at the financials of you know of how it's performing, what are the things that you worried about and cared about?
So at a project level, your financial triggers are pretty small, right? You have what does it cost? And again, think about project level as a consulting services organization, which is a little different. So as a group, we have a group of consultants on a project. We care about how much are we charging for the consultants and how much are we paying the consultants. So what is our delta, or what is our profit? And then what expenses do we have on the project? And that's it. It's pretty simple because there's not a lot. You have a handful of people. You're getting paid to leverage those people. Are you delivering what you said you were going to deliver so that you get paid, and that you're providing value for your client? And then, are you keeping the project expenses in line so you're not, going out and spending tens of thousands of dollars on dinners or private jets or whatever?
Right. So as you move from worrying about a project to worrying about a client, what are some of the things that can come into play when you're looking at the financials of a client?
Think of a little more flexibility, especially a larger client that I had. We had anywhere from 3 to 7 projects at any one point in time and up to almost 50 consultants across the client. It allowed you a little more flexibility. So for example, we were able to balance the financials across the client instead of an individual project. So we may have one project that's interesting that we're providing value to them on, but we have a really low profit margin. But as long as the other projects have a high enough margin to make up the difference, it gave you a little bit more flexibility holistically to look at your financials and to adjust across multiple projects instead of a single project. You're a little less locked in.
Right. So you have more variables because different projects have different margin. You may, at a 50-person client, have some client level expenses. You may have some people who aren't billing but are needed to make the project successful. And then you want to be able to tell that story as a whole.
Exactly.
So early on, as you owned a client, and things would change, and there was a variance. Um, what were the questions you'd tend to be asked? Of where maybe someone came and said, our revenue looks to be down by $30,000, or our margin is going down. What what position were you in at that point?
Someone asking the question would be Matt. And yeah, it was interesting because you'd look at, okay, well, last week you said the client was going to project X amount of money for the year, and a week later, now we're down Y. like you said, there's a lot of variables involved, right? Do we have someone who's non-billable who's putting more time against it, impacting the margin? Do we have somebody taking a 3-month vacation because they're going to Australia? Do we have a project that ends up not happening, or it gets pushed out and so it changes the dates? So a lot of things go into forecasting out the project. And one of the differences between looking at that, P&L, that forecast for something, for services versus for product, which is one of the adjustments I had to make, is your people are your product, which is not the same as if you have a product, right? If you're selling widgets, then you sell widgets. And if someone takes a vacation, they take a vacation. When you have consulting services, if someone takes a vacation, you're no longer billing that person for the week. So it can actually affect your revenue depending on your billing model. So making those adjustments was interesting and different for me. And then being able to look at and ask the right questions. Why are we down? Again, what are the things that are what's going on to make that difference? And then digging into those details. And frequently I would need to go back to the folks who are working at the project level and ask from an individual project standpoint, what's going on? Why are we down in this project over this project?
Yeah. And if I remember right, initially, as we were doing this, and this was one of our bigger accounts, you had the responsibility to be able to answer those questions and tell what changed. And you had the responsibility for updating the data. But you didn't actually have a view that showed you all the data for your account.
That is correct.
So if I remember correctly, originally, you had the responsibility to be able to explain what was happening at your clients, and your team was updating the data for your projects, but you didn't have a holistic view that would tell you exactly what changed across the client.
That's correct. I actually would end up pulling all of the different project information and exporting it, putting it into spreadsheets and manhandling the data so that I could get an idea of what was going on. And I actually ended up being someone who generated a new view in our software because we didn't have that view. We didn't have a means to see that, and we needed it.
Yeah. And there were a couple reasons why that data wasn't available. One was we were growing, and it used to only be a few people's responsibility to look across the system. So we didn't have the ability to slice and dice the data the way we needed once we had multiple people owning different books of business. And we also didn't have the security in place where we wanted to be able to trust people with some of the data, but not have to expose the entire company's data. So there were things that we had to build and create over time in order to support people being able to own what they were accountable for. So let's fast forward a little bit. So over time, you moved from being responsible for a account and the financials of that account to being responsible for a region or a set of accounts. What were the new things that you needed to worry about when being able to, or being responsible for the financial outcomes of a market or a region?
Well, the differences between the account level and the market or region were actually substantial. At the account level, it's a single client. So even though we did have to pull data across multiple projects, it's still a single client. It's still a single engagement. When you start looking across a group of clients or an entire region, one of the things that started to come into play was a bench. So at the client level, I was not responsible for a bench. So if I had 30 people on my, 30, 50, whatever people on the project, if we had 30 people and 5 people rolled off, I wasn't responsible in my P&L for those 5 people anymore. They just kind of went off into the regional P&L. Being responsible at a regional level meant I did need to manage the bench. So when you're looking at a profit and loss for the region, part of that for a consulting organization is your bench. So if I have 130 people, I can be making a lovely amount of top line revenue, but if 50 people are sitting on the bench and they're not billing projects, then my bottom, my net profit's going to be negative or negligible. So right. The addition of bench and making sure that we're optimizing the way that we're leveraging people across the different projects across the region was definitely one of the changes. The other was actually working with other regions when we did have a bench to find ways to place people on projects that weren't necessarily contributing to the top line that I was responsible for, but would help the top line of the company and would pull them off the bench so they were no longer causing a negative pull against both my region and then across the company level.
So at a project level, when you own that, you were only responsible for the profitability and the execution of that project. And then as you move to a client, you had more things to worry about, but and then as you move to a region, there were even more variables and more components you had to worry about. I think that as you're starting to work at a market or a region level, you start to have to worry about many more aspects of the business. Like you used bench as an example of my utilization. Do I have all of my people busy? And then the other side of it is, do I have enough people to do my work? So, if you sell, 2 projects and you only have enough people for one, then you have the set of open positions, which could become unrealized revenue. So what were the challenges in that?
The challenges in that, like you said, we're trying to look at what do we need from a people standpoint. So you don't want to have open positions that you can't fill, right? Because like you said, it's unrealized revenue. You also don't want to hire if you're looking at, if you're looking at now and you say, okay, I have 100 consultants. We'll make it an even number. I have 100 consultants. I have 95 filled positions. I have 2 projects I'm going to sell that are going to be starting in a month, and they require another 10 consultants. So if I look at just the moment, I go, oh, I need to hire 5 people, right? Because now I have 105 people worth of projects and I have, 100 people. However, that's not taking into account everything that's going on, right? I may have a project ending that has 20 people on it. I may have, another project starting 3 months after that has 15 people on it. So being able to see not just what's going on now or what went on yesterday, but being able to look forward and say what's going to happen next from a people standpoint is huge, because it allows you to see like, oh, I have a cliff in April. There's always a cliff in April for some reason, right? And so I have a cliff in April. Well, if I have a cliff in April and I'm fully at capacity now and it's January and someone wants to start a project, but I look in April and I have 50 consultants coming free, then I could go, well, instead of hiring people now that are also going to end up adding to my bench in April, maybe I talk to the client and see if we can delay the start of the project, or if we can thin down other projects and ramp it up more slowly. So you get creative with how you're handling things. But having the visibility to know that that's going to happen is essential in order to be able to make hiring decisions and staffing decisions.
So 2 questions. One, can you explain what a cliff is? Because that might not be clear to everybody. And 2, how far out would you tend to look in our business in order to plan?
So good question, Matt. A cliff is exactly what it sounds like. You look at your financials and they're going along at a lovely level, and all of a sudden there's a huge drop. So generally it happens when you have multiple projects end at once. And frequently, if you end up in a cycle where you're starting several projects at once, then you're more likely to end several projects at once. So if you have, for example, again, we'll go back to 100 consultants. If you have 100 consultants and 90 of them are booked all the way through to, we'll say April, and then all of a sudden in April you have, a client that's ending and a project over here that's ending, and now you only have 50 booked consultants. That's a cliff. Because literally, if you look at a graph of your revenue, it looks like you've fallen off a cliff.
Right.
And your second question, Matt?
And when do you want to start worrying about that cliff? Or, how far out can you actually see a cliff?
I can see a cliff as far out as my data will let me see it. So because I have a variety of projects at any point in time, right? I may have 3 projects that are 2 months long, and I may have a project that's 6 months long, and I may have a project that's a year long. So being able to see how everything layers in, the further out I can look, obviously it's like anything else. Like there's that cone of uncertainty. The closer in it is, the more accurate it is. But being able to look out, if I'm in October and I'm looking at, I have a problem in April, well, I need my sales team to start ramping up and looking at filling that April problem, right? If I wait until January or February or God worse March to think about there's a problem in April, that's too late. That's too late for my sales team and for my development leaders to be able to get out there and find places to book those people. And now I'm in a position where I have a lot of people that are coming available and I need to find something to do with them.
Yeah. So, and that one of the things, as a leader who had multiple people with multiple P&Ls, it was always important to look and understand, are the cliffs aligning, right? So do all of the different accounts seem to have projects ending at the same point in time, or are some growing and some shrinking? And the further out you could see that, the better, right? One is we would set up cadences that would always review the next month and the next 3 months so that we could be constantly looking to see what's ending, what's starting, and we could make good decisions about should we be hiring people in one region and having a bunch of people coming available in another region, right? Within a tolerance, you really don't want to have all the different markets worrying about each other, right? So let's say you have 10% bench or a 5% bench tolerance. If there's 5% of the people on the bench at any point in time, your financials might be set up to deal with that, and that's fine. And then in another market, if they have 0% on the bench and they need to be hiring, that's fine because you trust that your markets are going to solve their individual problems. But once you see things going beyond those tolerances, you need to have that visibility far enough out, right? What I would want would be people like Kimberly to be worrying, obviously about the next 2 or 3 months to make sure their deals are inked, but thinking about what's going to happen in the next 6 months at my accounts, so that then as I'm seeing these things materialize, if there's options out there, there's things that can be done. We can try to accelerate certain deals and so forth. So that visibility and that forward-looking piece where the data can align can help me understand, is that cliff real, and make strategic decisions about, is it time to pull back on hiring? Is it time to invest more in hiring? Is it time to push harder on sales? Is it time to you never pull back on sales, but you will try to deal time and say, all right, we have a deal, let's start on this date so that all the people are available and we can have a good plan, right? So all of those decisions are critical. They need information and data about what's happening in the future. And I think the same thing, Kimberly, when you're working at a market level, it's just a smaller business, but you end up having to worry about sales, utilization of people, project execution, all of the different pieces, just in a subset of the business.
Absolutely. And there are some things also that are impacted that we're not talking about that matter. So if you're thinking about hiring people, or you're thinking about where your revenue is or where your profit is, if you're expanding your business and you have a physical location, do you need a bigger space? Do you have a bunch of people coming to the bench that need to be in your space? So there's also spatial concerns and other things like that are tied into those financials and those projections that we don't always talk about on an everyday basis, but those decisions are also impacted by that visibility. You're not going to decide in April that you do or don't need a new space in April, right? You're gonna be looking at 6 months, a year ahead, and looking at your financials and looking at where you're at and being able to make those kinds of decisions.
Yeah. So one thing I've just noticed that we're kind of taking as a given, but isn't a given across the industry, is how tightly coupled the data is about, here's my sales pipeline, and then here's my utilization of my people availability, and then here's my recruiting pipeline, and how all three of those relate. So let's start with talking about how they're tied, and how we used to kind of force you to make a bet on the sale if you wanted to make a bet on the hire, and kind of what behaviors those created.
I think make a bet is a really good way of putting it. We had different project states And we literally said there's a percentage accuracy. If I'm 75% sure this is going to happen, this is the state I put it in. If I'm 80% this, if I'm 95 or above, this is what I'm going to label it. If I'm in the squishy 50-50 range, then here's where I leave it. And so, yeah, it was interesting because there's a balancing act between saying, all right, if I have 5 projects at 75% starting in April, how many of those are going to land? All right. And if 3 of those land, how many people do I need to hire? If 2 land, how many people do I need to hire? And what do those teams look like? And being able to, again, it's a lot of looking forward. And I think that one of the things that when we changed systems and companies, that was a big issue, was losing the ability to do that and trying to make decisions without being able to see what was coming. And so, what happens if I'm going to make a bet on something, right? I'm not in a casino gambling. This is a business. We are making a bet, but you're making an educated guess. The more information I have about how those different things impact, our financials and our business, not just in the moment, but moving forward, helps you make those decisions. It also helps you make the decision if you have 5 projects that may hit and I've only got so many resources to spend financially or people to spend time on closing the deals. Which ones have the best impact? Where do I want to spend my time and energy? And I need to be able to see that and figure that out.
Yeah, so this language of making a bet just recognizes that even if you have great data, it's only your current understanding and your best guess of what's going to happen, right? So at some point you have to take a risk. In all businesses, every decision in a business is some level of risk. So I may say I want to hire 10 people. I want to make that decision with the best data possible. Here's what we think we're going to win in future projects. Here's when we think these projects are going to end. Here's who we have available. And having all of that data together means I can make the best decision I can make on that day. The next day, a project might end early. We might win a different deal. Someone may resign. There's all kinds of change, and you can't prevent that. But what you can do is make sure that at any point in time when you're making a decision, you have the best data possible in order to make that decision. And so we're focused on the fact that all of these pieces of data need to align and need to help, be in concert with each other so you can make good decisions. So Kimberly, you touched on it for a minute, but you got to experience as we sold the company and transitioned to new systems in a much larger organization. What were some of the pains that you experienced as either you had less visibility to future projections, or the data for who to hire and who's available and so forth was not connected anymore?
So it was funny because before we cut over systems, Matt actually said, "You're going to miss the system we have," because we always joked about we had a homegrown system. It was kind of kludgy. It wasn't user friendly, but it did the job. And when we did cut over, my analogy is always that I felt like I was flying an airplane, and all of a sudden, all of my instruments went dark. So I went from being able to see where I was going and that I was on track for my destination and how much fuel I had left and whether or not I was about to pop out of a cloud and run into a mountain, to seeing nothing. We went from having one system to having multiple systems, none of which talk to each other. In order to try to make up for that, we would get this spreadsheet once a week that several people spent an alarming amount of time pulling together, that we were never entirely sure how accurate it was. And so when we were trying to look forward to make decisions, we ended up hiring people when we really probably shouldn't have hired people, because when we're looking forward and trying to say, hey, we shouldn't hire people yet, it's really hard to say why if you don't have the data. So we're raising our hand and saying we need to slow down on hiring. Why? Well, because we don't have the projections to support it. If you don't have the data to show that you don't have the projections to support hiring, then it's really hard to argue against it. And that's one of the places that I found myself in.
Right. So, so that connected data, that timeliness of data is essential. So, ultimately what I wanted to talk about here was kind of that journey, and different things are needed by different people. So if you're owning a project, there's a certain set of decisions you need to make, and there's a certain set of information you need. If you own a client, there's more information you need and more decisions. If you own a region or a market or a practice, you need to be able to understand the decisions for your area of data. And then if you're running an organization, you need to see all of those subsets of data come together so that you can make a holistic decision. So, a lot of this is just making sure that you have accurate data that's your best guess of what's happening in the future, and you're not reliant on disconnected data or historical data that's at best out of date, but and may not reflect where the business is going. It's just reflecting where the business has been. So thank you, Kimberly. I think this was a good discussion. I know there's more we could discuss in each of these areas, and I'm sure we will in the future. But if you have any questions or thoughts, reach out to us or subscribe, and there'll be more content. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. I'm looking forward to it.